This is Harsh Rules, I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play The Last 100 Yards, Airborne Over Europe. The Last 100 Yards, Airborne Over Europe was released in 2020 by GMT Games and designed by Mike Denson. This game supports up to 2 players, and each scenario takes from 1 to 3 hours to play. Before we begin this episode, I'd like to recognize the Harsh Rules Patreon supporters that help make content like this possible. If you'd like to support the channel, head over to patreon.com/harshrules to learn more. And once again, thank you for your support. The Last 100 Yard series continues to grow. Currently, it is composed of 3 core games, all designed around a foundational rule set. Each of these core games can be played independently from the others, so if you miss Volume 1, you can play from Airborne Over Europe, which is Volume 2, or Volume 3, The Solomon Islands. Upcoming entries, though, will use the first 2 volumes. This includes Mission Pack 1 and the recently announced Volume 4, The Russian Front. The first 6 episodes in this series cover the foundational rules with an emphasis on Volume 1. Volume 2 and Volume 3 utilize the same rule set with additional unique rules for their particular focus. In this episode, we're going to be covering those unique rules for Airborne Over Europe. Therefore, if you're new to this series and you own Airborne Over Europe, I recommend you watch the first 6 episodes before proceeding with this one. Now, with all of that said, let's go ahead and get started. The Last 100 Yards, Airborne Over Europe contains 10 new missions. 6 of these missions take place during Operation Market Garden, and 4 during D-Day, which is also known as Operation Overlord. Airborne Over Europe introduces 3 new sets of rules to the series: Elite Units, Airdrops, and Night and Twilight rules. All 10 missions use Elite Units in some fashion. 2 missions use Airdrop and Night and Twilight rules. I'm going to cover all 3 sets of these rules in this episode, so let's get started with Elite Units. Each mission in the Mission Special Rules section will inform players which units are classified as elite. For example, in Mission 13, American airborne units are elite. However, let's look more broadly at which units this series typically classifies as elite and how their counters are differentiated. Elite units can be differentiated from regular units by their counter colors and in many cases a parachute symbol. For example, US paratroopers are elite units. Their counters are a darker shade of green and they have a parachute symbol. However, elite German infantry are a darker shade of gray and they do not have a parachute symbol. But elite German paratroopers are light blue with the parachute symbol. You'll also find elite counters for platoon leaders, machine gun sections, light anti-tank weapons, and towed guns, as well as mortar forward observers. So now that we know what to look for, what makes elite units special? Elite units employ the same weapons as regular units, but perform much better under fire. You'll notice the stats on these counters are mostly the same. The primary differences between regular and elite units are in their relative levels of initiative, coordination, teamwork, and leadership. In other words, elite units are much more likely to get back into the fight quicker. These skill differences are captured in gameplay with die roll modifiers, in other words, DRMs. Let's take a look. Elite companies receive a favorable coordination die roll modifier of +3. This means that elite companies will successfully achieve coordination 60% of the time versus 30% for regular units. This substantially increases the ability of elite units to envelop the enemy during an assault. These skills reflect the greater emphasis on the training, coordination, and teamwork of elite units. A non-vehicular elite unit receives a -1 die roll modifier for all disruption, regrouping, and withdrawal attempts. Elite units receive a favorable recovery die roll modifier when attempting recovery, and therefore increasing their chances. In addition, elite units rally on a die roll less than or equal to 2, and less than or equal to 3 if assisted by their platoon leader. This means they will return to action quicker than regular units. For leadership, elite platoon leaders have a cohesion value of 7 and as a result have a greater impact on the effectiveness of their subordinates under fire. As for initiative, forces that have elite units in whole or in part will likely have an enhanced initiative modifier. At the squad level, unlike regular units, elite units that are disrupted can conduct a limited reaction to recover after any enemy call for reaction. This can occur regardless of whether they observe an enemy action, or are stacked with or adjacent to, if in an open terrain or on a road, their platoon leader. This reflects the superior training and experience of the NCOs at the squad level. And now that we have a better understanding of elite units, let's take a look at airborne landings. Scenarios with airdrop rules add an additional layer of strategy to the game. Let's begin with some airborne basics. Airdropped units will utilize 3 hexes on a map: a landing zone hex, an assembly point hex, and finally the mission objective hex. Airdropped units are deployed in sticks. A stick is a group of paratroopers that jump from an aircraft while passing over a targeted landing zone. If the scenario's mission special rules section does not identify a specific hex as a landing zone, the player may select any hex on the map. However, paratrooper landing zones cannot be placed within 3 hexes of each other. Once paratroopers have landed, they must first assemble at a hex with an assembly marker before advancing towards their objective, even if that assembly hex contains an enemy unit. The assembly marker for each paratrooper platoon can be placed in any hex on the map, provided the hex is no closer than 5 or farther than 10 hexes from any mission objective. Only the active player can conduct airborne landings. However, before any airborne company landings can be conducted, all other units on the ground must be activated first. Note that there is no individual platoon activation in an airborne landing. Instead, all units land simultaneously in a single activation. The action of landing is considered a maneuver action, and each landed unit is thus marked as having conducted an action. Once the landing procedure for all landing units has been completed, play immediately proceeds to the enemy player's reaction. There is no reaction by the landing units, as the landing constitutes their action for the game turn. The player conducting an airdrop must execute and complete each individual step in the landing procedure. First, establish the landing plan. Next, placement of landing units. Third, paratrooper landing dispersal. And finally, paratrooper landing resolution. Next, let's take a look at each of these steps in greater detail. Immediately prior to conducting an airborne landing, the player conducting that landing must organize their landing forces into individual sticks, or gliders. Let's first look at the options for paratrooper sticks. The first stick option is for a single platoon. This means their squads, which have not been deployed into sections, plus their platoon leader. The next option is for one towed gun, including its inherent carrier, in other words a truck, or a light vehicle. The final option is for a heavy weapons stick, which is limited to 5 support units, which can consist of machine guns, light anti-tank weapon, mortar sections, and mortar platoons. For mortars, use the corresponding forward observer marker to keep track of this. Each glider is limited to the following: 4 steps of infantry and/or machine guns and 1 non-combat unit, or one towed gun, including its inherent carrier, or a mortar section or mortar platoon, or one light vehicle. The second step of the landing procedure is for landing placement. In this step, the landing player places the units of each stick or glider in their landing hex. Unless stated otherwise in a scenario's Mission Special Rules section, this can be any hex on the map. Remember, for paratrooper landing zones, they cannot be placed within 3 hexes of each other. Each glider landing zone must be the last hex in a line of at least 3 open terrain skid hexes, which define the direction of travel. All gliders landing in the same game turn must land in the same direction. Gliders can share skid hexes, but not landing zone hexes. Next, the assembly marker for each paratrooper platoon can be placed in any hex on the map, provided the hex is no closer than 5 or farther than 10 hexes from any mission objective. The assembly marker for each glider platoon is placed in the landing zone containing the glider platoon's platoon leader. Step 3 of the landing procedure is for the paratrooper landing dispersal. This step is only for paratroopers since gliders do not disperse. Once all units of each stick have been placed in a landing zone, the landing player refers to the scatter diagram on the map to determine their final landing hex. If the designated landing zone hex straddles 2 sector maps, the landing player must designate which scatter diagram is to be used prior to the landing dispersal die roll. The landing player then conducts a landing dispersal die roll for each unit in the stick to determine where they land. The landing player rolls 1d6 for direction and 1d6 for distance for each landing unit and immediately relocates that unit to its final landing hex. The final step in the landing procedure is for paratrooper or glider landing resolution. For paratroopers, once all landing units have been dispersed, the landing player must conduct a landing check with a 10-sided die for each landing unit. These checks are conducted in the following order based on the type of terrain they land in. First, for units that land in open or orchard terrain, if an infantry or platoon leader, they will disrupt if the die roll is greater than the unit's cohesion and suffer a casualty if the die roll equals 10. Non-vehicular support units automatically disrupt and suffer a casualty if the die roll equals 10, and vehicles and mortars are destroyed if the die roll is 10. When landing in tree-lined, sunken road, river, marsh, buildings, or even off-board, non-vehicular units automatically suffer a casualty and disrupt. If landing off-board, surviving sections are placed disrupted in the last full hex on the board edge. Vehicles and mortars are destroyed. If any non-vehicular units land in a hex occupied by enemy combat units, place an assault marker corresponding to the nationality of the enemy unit in the hex. The assault is resolved normally in the assault resolution phase, but the enemy player is the attacker. A vehicle or mortar landing in an assault hex is destroyed unless the hex contains a friendly infantry unit, and if so, are ignored for assault resolution purposes and destroyed if the enemy player wins the assault. Finally, at the end of this step, the landing player calls for reaction once he has resolved his landings. Next, let's talk about glider landing resolution. Once all gliders have been placed in their landing zone, the landing player resolves glider landings in the following order. First, landing off map. The landing player makes a die roll for each glider to determine whether it has been blown off course, causing it to land off map. A glider lands off map on an unmodified die roll of 10. A quick note, mission special rules may allow surviving units to interplay later in the mission even if they land off map. Second, crash determination. The landing player conducts a die roll for each glider to determine whether the glider crashed. A glider crashed if the modified die roll is greater than or equal to 9. The die roll is increased by 1 due to an increased risk of crashing if at any point along its skid path there is an adjacent hex that is blocking terrain hex, or contains a blocking terrain feature, like water or another glider, or it lands off map. If the landing occurs at night, the die roll is further increased by 1. Regardless of whether a glider crashes or lands, each unit must be checked with a die roll. Non-vehicular units in a glider that does not crash must conduct a cohesion check and disrupt if they fail. Non-vehicular units in a glider that crashes must conduct a cohesion check. If the die result is less than or equal to their cohesion, they disrupt, and if greater than their cohesion, they suffer a casualty and disrupt. If the glider crashes, the player must make a die roll for each vehicle or mortar. If the die roll is greater than 7, the unit is destroyed. After that, check a glider that lands in an enemy occupied hex. If any surviving non-vehicular units land in a hex occupied by enemy combat units, place an assault marker corresponding to the nationality of the enemy unit in the hex. The assault is resolved normally in the assault resolution phase, but the enemy player is the attacker. A vehicle or mortar landing in an assault hex is destroyed unless the hex contains a friendly infantry unit, and if so, are ignored for assault resolution purposes and destroyed if the enemy player wins the assault. A final note on landing casualties. Casualties suffered because of a landing resolution do not count as casualties for the casualty differential limit purposes. In other words, they do not move the casualty marker. These casualties. Finally, the landing player calls for reaction once he has resolved all his landings. A final note about landing casualties. Casualties suffered because of a landing resolution do not count as casualties for the casualty differential limit. In other words, they do not move the casualty marker. These casualties can, however, be recovered due to a random event medic result. If a mortar is destroyed, it is removed from play unless it is a mortar platoon. Remember, mortar platoons are never destroyed, but instead remain in play with all the normal characteristics of a mortar section. Paratrooper units, once they've landed, must first assemble before advancing towards their objective. A paratrooper platoon is assembled the moment its leader and the equivalent of 2 undisrupted squads, in other words 4 steps, are in or adjacent to their assembly hex. Once assembled, units may advance on their objective. Any remaining unassembled units of the platoon must first move into or adjacent to their assembly hex prior to advancing to their objective. Vehicles and heavy weapon units may assemble in any recorded assembly hex and then become available to support a platoon. Units in the following cases are not required to assemble: undisrupted infantry, including any undisrupted support units in the same hex landing within 2 hexes of an enemy unit or closer to their objective than their assembly hex. The platoon has less than 4 steps of infantry units remaining. Heroic units, units landing by glider, and finally mortars instead are placed in the mortar support pending box. A final note about assembly hexes in regards to units withdrawing or retreating. In general, non-vehicular airborne units withdraw or retreat towards their platoon assembly hex or a friendly controlled objective. If a unit's platoon assembly hex is occupied by an enemy combat unit, they can withdraw or retreat toward a friendly controlled objective or the closest assembly hex of another platoon. In either case, withdrawing or retreating units may end their maneuver in or adjacent to a friendly assembly hex or controlled objective. Night and Twilight rules are only in effect when stated in a scenario's Mission Special Rules section. 2 missions in Airborne Over Europe have these rules: Mission 19, Currahee, and Mission 22, Geronimo. Another way to consider these rules are as scenarios that begin before dawn. Using the time track, night missions will be in effect for a specified number of minutes. Twilight always lasts 10 minutes, and any time after that falls under normal daylight rules. While playing during night, the following rules are in effect. Small arms fire is less effective and suffers with a -1 die roll modifier. The effectiveness of recon result on the random event table is reduced. A player may only remove a concealment marker within 3 hexes as opposed to the normal 5 hexes. Finally, nighttime maneuver allowance is also reduced. During nighttime activation, non-vehicles are limited to 2 movement points, vehicles 3 movement points. Please note, this does not affect heroic actions. In nighttime reaction, non-vehicles are limited to 1 movement point and vehicles 2 movement points. Also during nighttime maneuvers, no road bonus is allowed. Line of sight and concealment become more complex with Night and Twilight rules. With that in mind, I'm going to try to keep this as simple as possible. In normal daylight conditions, line of sight with an enemy unit can be established if there is not a hindrance like a building. At distances greater than 8 hexes, a unit may receive a -1 concealment bonus. Concealment characterizes the situation in which the general location and type of unit is known, but its specific location has not been determined. Keep that in mind as we now go into Night and Twilight rules. With Night and Twilight conditions, line of sight is limited. During Twilight, there is a line of sight limit for non-vehicles of 4 hexes. The line of sight limit for vehicles is 8 hexes. However, concealment is not lost until an enemy is within 2 hexes. Night conditions are even more extreme. Line of sight is limited to 2 hexes. Concealment is lost if a unit fires from or maneuvers into a hex adjacent to an enemy unit during night turns. Concealment may also be lost if the result of a final fire resolution die roll is greater than or equal to the cohesion of the affected unit, or the assault resolution in which it participated ends. Now that we've discussed line of sight and concealment, let's also take a look at illumination. A scenario's mission special rules may allow the use of illumination. When allowed, a player may make an illumination request once per night game turn. An illumination request can occur as the result of a platoon activation or in reaction, and it does not count as an action by the requesting unit. To conduct an illumination request, the requesting unit must be activated or eligible to react. The target hex must be within 4 hexes of the requesting unit and in or adjacent to an enemy-occupied hex to be illuminated. Line of sight to the target hex is not required for illumination requests. The illumination request occurs before the requesting unit conducts any action. For observation and reaction purposes, an illumination marker placed during a reaction segment illuminates any enemy action within its radius that occurred in the immediately preceding segment. Units that fired in the preceding segment immediately prior to the segment the illumination occurred do not retroactively benefit from the illumination, while any reaction fire occurring during the segment the illumination occurs would benefit. Let's walk through the illumination procedure. First, the requesting player specifies the requesting unit, the target hex to be illuminated, and makes a die roll. Next, if the die roll is less than or equal to 5, the illumination request is granted. The request is not granted if the die roll is greater than 5. After that, if granted, the requesting player conducts an accuracy die roll. If the roll is greater than or equal to 7, the illumination marker is placed in the specified target hex. If the die roll is 1 through 6, refer to the scatter diagram on the sector map. This will determine the direction from the primary impact hex. Then place the illumination marker 2 hexes from this position. Also note that illumination markers are removed from play during step 1 of the mortar fire adjustment phase and cannot be extended. Light extends with a radius of 2 hexes in all directions from the illumination marker. For purposes of line of sight, concealment, revealing hidden units, and any action, the hexes within the illuminated area are treated as day. Units outside the illuminated area but within 2 hexes may fire at targets within the illuminated area without the night penalty. Units within the illuminated area may fire at targets in non-illuminated hexes within 2 hexes of the illuminated hex, but suffer the night penalty when doing so. Finally, units beginning their maneuver in or adjacent to an illuminated hex, and whose movement path includes only illuminated hexes, may use the day movement allowance. In all other cases, though, night movement allowances apply. And now that we've covered elite units, airdrops, and Night and Twilight rules, you should be ready to play The Last 100 Yards, Airborne Over Europe. If you found this video helpful, please give me a like and share with your friends. To be the first notified when the next episode of Harsh Rules becomes available, please hit the bell icon for notifications. And as always, this has been Harsh for Harsh Rules. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video.